It is August 6th, 2026, and we are at an incredibly important point, not just in the ongoing war of aggression against Iran, in which we are watching the Iranian people stand up for their country like never before, but also in our very existence when it comes to the threat that is posed by the West, by the Zionist movement as a whole, and the ways in which they are continuing to target the civilians of West Asia, whether that's by the genocide in Palestine, whether that's the ethnic cleansing targeting South Lebanon, whether that's the ongoing war against Iran. There is a movement not just to carry out a literal military war or an ongoing occupation, but also to silence any and all criticism, which makes the recent decision by the UK's Employment Appeal Tribunal even more notable, as they ruled that being anti Zionist is a protected philosophical belief. So, what does that mean in today's standards? And what is the precedent that is set not only by this case, but by this moment in history? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest who was at the center of that very case earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is David Miller, a professor of political sociology, director at Spinwatch, and producer of Palestine Declassified. Professor Miller, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
It's a pleasure. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, but I actually want to start off with what has been happening in your case specifically, because I know that you were fired by the University of Bristol back in 2021 over your criticism of Zionism. And this week, the UK's Employment Appeal Tribunal ruled that the decision to fire you was an unlawful act of direct discrimination and that being anti Zionist is a protected philosophical belief. Now, I know it has been a long journey to get to this point. Will you start out by explaining the significance of the precedent set by your case?
Sure. So I was sacked in October 2021. The university said that I was sacked because my comments didn't reach the professional standards required of staff. And it was nothing to do with anti-Zionism. The first tribunal, which began in October 2023, 9 days after the launch of the Palestinian resistance operation at Al-Aqsa Flood, determined in early 2024 that that was not the real reason I was sacked. That the real reason I was sacked was because I had anti-Zionist views, and the university believed that those were beyond the pale. And so they determined that I was sacked for anti-Zionist views, but they also determined that these views, as pled by me in court, were worthy of respect in a democratic society. So I'd said that Zionism is inherently racist, it's inherently colonial, and it's inherently imperialistic, which at the time to some people seemed as if it was radical. But of course, many millions of people have come to see that that's the case since then. And that definition of Zionism, which was given by me, was said to be worthy of respect in a democratic society. And if anyone was sacked for those kinds of views, that would be illegal. And so we had that judgment in February 2024, and then the university decided to appeal the judgment. Now, of course, what happens with an appeal is that if the judgment is confirmed, that becomes a legal precedent. And so from henceforth, any person who takes an industrial tribunal case will be protected by this judgment because no industrial tribunal is able to go against the findings of this appeal case because it's one level above. So that's the victory we've won for everybody, should they come to be disciplined or fired or discriminated against by their employer, any employer across the whole country, not just universities. And that, of course, stands on the record until or unless it is appealed to a higher court and overturned, which seems at present unlikely.
Yeah, and it's really incredible when we look back. I know even as recently as 2021, right, you can see the ways in which society has shifted their views of the Zionist movement and how it has become more popular to be critical of it, to call out the fact that the Zionists, that Israel as a state right now is carrying out an all-out genocide against the Palestinian people. How have you seen that shift happen between 2021 to now, where now more people are talking about it? Now it's becoming more popular to be anti-Zionist, but there certainly was a time where that was much more taboo and almost conspiratorial by some people when they saw not just that movement, but that criticism and that belief system.
Sure. Well, so back then, as you say, for some people, even in our movement, to use the word Zionist was to be irresponsible, perhaps to be shading into conspiracy theory, and that it was something which should be avoided because it might lead to dark places. And of course, also it was said that the term Zio was somehow even worse. That if you use the word Zio, that was more or less tantamount to anti-Semitism. And there was an investigation on behalf of the Labour Party back in 2015-16, which said that was the case, that using the term Zio was anti-Semitic. But that is comprehensively destroyed, that no one thinks that anymore. There are still people who are reluctant to use the term Zionism and to think about what it means, and they prefer to use terms like the Israel lobby, and they prefer not to look too deeply into the Zionist movement, either in terms of its support for genocide, for the occupation forces, for the settlements, or in terms of its more important role in the US and UK, which is its role in radicalization, the radicalization of young Jewish kids into becoming believing Zionists. So all of that has come onto the political and the research agenda in a way which it wasn't in 2021. So that's a real advance. But there are lots of people who still need to be dragged along, kicking and screaming, if I can put it like that, into understanding that there's something much more to look at here than just the question of the Israel lobby, just the question of AIPAC.
Yeah, and it's interesting how when you look at the Zionist movement, for them, propaganda is the backbone of their movement, right? This idea that anti-Zionism is somehow anti-Semitism, that you can't criticize what they're doing, that it's like they rely so heavily on it. And at a time like right now, calling out the Zionists, that is calling out the ongoing genocide, right? That is calling out what they're doing in the ways in which they're targeting the Palestinian people, the Lebanese, and their plans to continue to target the entire region around what is known as Israel today. How important is taking a stand against this propaganda war in today's age, especially with all of the efforts by the Zionist movement to not only carry out this genocide, but to go after anyone who criticizes it?
Well, I mean, I think there's been an attempt by them to blur the lines further between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism than was the case before. It used to be the case that they would the main organizations like in the US, the ADL, or the equivalent of the ADL in the UK is the Community Security Trust, the organization which took the first complaint against me in 2019. Those organizations, they used to kind of accept that it was okay to call for solidarity with the Palestinians. It was okay to call for a two-state solution. It was okay to argue that Likud, or the particular Israeli government of the day, was engaged in unacceptable policies. But you couldn't go any further than that. But now they've tried to narrow that down even further, so that even if you criticize Netanyahu, it's somehow said to be anti-Semitic. And that's been their attempt, because, of course, in the last 3 years, with the launch of the genocide, the renewal of the genocide in Gaza, millions and millions of people have seen the scales fall from their eyes and begun to understand what Zionism is, which is what we'd always been saying it was, which is it's a racist, eliminationist, and maximalist ideology. And so that's difficult for them, because people are pushing back against them. And as you say, propaganda is central to that, and as everybody who pays attention to these things knows, they spend millions and millions of dollars on the propaganda. Just of course in the US, and in the last year, there's been these new foreign agents registered on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who are engaged in all sorts of no good propaganda, including tracking people's mobile phones when they go to church or to university, and then sending them unasked for messages, and all that stuff is now being widely reported, at least in the independent media. So yes, of course, propaganda is part of it because they know that they're losing, and they have to find ways to force people back onto the right path. And of course, propaganda is a key part of that, but also it requires an element of coercion, an element of bullying, of intimidation, of people in jobs who to try and get them sacked, and indeed, of course, of politicians. As we see with in the case of APAC and all the bullying that goes on with politicians in the US, the UK, France, Germany, and everywhere else. So all of that is part of the mix, and they're doing that because they are losing. They've lost the battle for public opinion, and they have to try and hang on by clinging on to their dominance the elite political level.
It has been interesting to see how much money has been poured into, especially here in the US and political races just this year, where there is such a push by the Zionist movement to make sure that they get their candidate in and that they go after anyone who even is critical of them. And yet they have the majority of the candidates in the US Congress. And speaking of the Zionists losing, I know that that really goes towards not only the political war, the public war, but also the ongoing war in Iran. And it has been really kind of fascinating to watch as the US and Israel have tried desperately to achieve regime change in Iran, right? They've targeted protests, they've literally carried out a decapitation strike and gone after Iran's leadership. And yet the Iranian people have not fallen for it. They have not taken to the streets to overthrow their government. If anything, they have continued in support of their government even more. And now we have Iran fighting back with not only this military war, but also this economic war. How do you see the significance of the war in Iran and really the overall fight that it is bringing to the Americans, to the Zionist, kind of the West as a whole in today's world?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, obviously, there was opposition in Iran in January to government policies, and it started off in the bazaar in Tehran, where there was a hike in prices and there was a lot of pressure on the currency, which of course had been organized externally by the Zionists and by indeed the UAE. And so there was genuine protest there, which the government, was fine about. And what, of course, that then happened was that the Mossad activated their people on the ground. They sent in people from the Kurdish areas and elsewhere to start to attack police stations and petrol mosques and all of those kinds of things. And that's where we saw the 2 nights essentially of unbridled bloodlust by Western assets, mainly from the Mossad, probably also from the CIA. And that's what led to the idea that there were, what's the figure they use now, 42,000 people killed by the regime, as they call it. Now, of course, that was a complete fiction. We know who died in that period. There were 3,200 or so people who died. The government has named every single one of them, and most of those, of course, were killed by the protesters sent in by the Mossad. And you can tell that by the names of who they are, including many police officers and members of the Basiji, which is the militia which supports the IRGC in Iran. So all of that was a propaganda thing, was to try and create the idea that there was this mass uprising in Iran, and that would lead to a breakdown of law and order and eventually to regime change. But it didn't work. It was 2 nights, and it was brought under control by the government. And that option didn't work. So they had to put on the table the other option, which was an attack on Iran. And of course, they then launched that attack later the next month. Both the US and the Zionists launched that attack. And like the previous one, the previous year, it didn't really have the effect that they thought it would have. They thought it would bring the so-called regime to its knees. They, of course, launched the strike on the leadership, killing the leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and of course his granddaughter and his various others of his relatives. Lots of people died, but they didn't in any way dent the capacity of Iran to fight back, and that's really caused surprise and consternation, strangely, amongst the kind of elite military theorists in the Zionist entity and in the US, because they don't understand why is an impoverished country like this, which has been under sanctions for 47 years, how is it able to resist? And of course, the reason is that they've developed this extraordinary advanced missile technology, which is where the materials for the missiles are produced not in open factories. Some of them are, some of the parts are, but largely underground, deep underground, where even the most powerful American bombs, the bunker busters, etc., can't reach them. And the missile launchers also, they're mobile or they're underground and hidden, and they can't get to those missile launchers. And in response, what happened was that the Iranians systematically took out every single radar station in all these different US bases around the region, in Bahrain, in Saudi, in Jordan, in the UAE, and even in Qatar, the country which is less hostile to Iran than the other ones. And so that was a problem for them. And so what they've not realized is that they cannot defeat Iran. Iran's a huge country. It's surrounded by mountains. A ground assault would be highly dangerous for the Americans. They would lose thousands of troops. And so in the end, they've had to stop. They had the ceasefire, and then they broke the ceasefire, and then the US just stopped. They didn't say they were going to stop, but they stopped because they are effectively defeated. Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz, unchallenged. Whenever there's a challenge to that, but by the Americans trying to push oil tankers through, the tankers are hit and they turn round, or they take the Iranian route through the strait. So that there's a change in the way in which this operates, which means that Iran now has the dominance over the strait, can't be defeated militarily, and the Americans and the Zionists don't know what to do about that, and they have sometimes slightly different views on how they should take that forward. So that I think, I mean, I've rambled a bit here, but that's a kind of overview of where we've got to. And although it seemed like the Iranians were willing to make a deal, and which would have given away some of the cards they had in their hand, in the end, I think there was a kind of pushback internally by the more revolutionary elements of the governing elite, the IRGC, and some others, against some of the reformists, including around the figure of the president and of the foreign minister, who are much more reformist. And that there's been a bit of a stiffening of the backbone, and that seems to have done really wonders for the ability of Iran to repel the attacks by the US and by the Zionists.
Yeah, it has been just fascinating to watch the way that this has unfolded. And exactly as you're describing it there, right? Iran is in this position where, and I know that for many years the West has dreamed of a war against Iran, but there are a lot of reasons why they haven't followed through and tried to make those dreams a reality. Now we have the Trump administration. Obviously, Trump has the Zionist lobby directly in his ear, right? He's got Netanyahu making, I think it's 8 trips at this point to
Yeah.
meet with Trump just in this term alone and bragging about it publicly, right? You have Israel bragging over here, oh, the US is fighting the war against Iran for us. But the West is not in a good position right now. I mean, we have constant reports here in the US about the munition shortages, the ways in which the US doesn't have long range weapons, interceptor missiles, so on and so forth. And then we get the latest propaganda piece out saying that, oh, Trump is feuding with Pete Hegseth, and they're just trying to add another cloud to, I guess, all of the noise that is out there. But the reality is that the West is not in a good position. China's over here restricting rare earth magnets that can be used by the US military, now also restricting that supply to Europe and to their militaries as well. And so when you look at kind of the West and the position that it's in and its ability to continue to project power, to carry out wars like this one in Iran, how do you see it, and what is the significance of the moment that we're in, especially with Iran continuing to fight back?
Well, look, I mean, there's a lot of arguments and debates about this in the kind of what should we call it, the imperialism critical camp, which I would include some people who are not that critical of imperialism. Some people on the right, some the ex-CIA lot, the ex-military lot, the US military lot. the realist scholars, etc., but who all agree with the rest of the anti-imperialist camp on many of the positions. But there's a debate, isn't there, about the extent to which we are moving into a post-unipolar world. That the On one side of the argument, there is the idea that the BRICS will develop, that it means that US power is going to diminish, that they won't be able to project power anymore, and that actually we're going to move to a multipolar world, and we're almost already there. On the other hand, there are those who say, well, no, imperial power remains, it remains extremely strong. The Americans specifically, not including the Zionists, are a hugely powerful imperialist nation. Their role in Venezuela, the assault on Greenland, all of those kinds of things show that the Americans still have very significant power. And I think that there's much to be said for that second argument. But I would complicate matters by saying that I think that where we're moving is towards a greater and greater power for the Zionists, for what I've called Pax Judaica. Now, I think we're moving in a direction which will suggest that the Zionists will be able to project power in a much greater way than has historically been the case. Not just through, obviously not through their own intrinsic military strength through the IOF and all of that, but through their colonization and use as a proxy of other nations. In particular, of course, the US is foremost amongst them, and the recent change in legislation which merges, or is said to merge, the IOF with the US military, which of course is not a merger because it's only a one-way agreement, that the Israelis get access to the Pentagon, but the Pentagon doesn't get access to the bases in occupied Palestine. So that I think is an important element. Now, Netanyahu has been saying, look, we are becoming a superpower. He's used that term. I think it was 2 months ago now he used the term. They see themselves as being dominant in West Asia. They've taken chunks of Lebanon again. They're in Syria. They want to expand through not just to Greater Israel, which was always their aim, the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, but also to the whole of West Asia. And they do that through, of course, the Abraham Accords for normalization, which of course is led by the UAE. Morocco signed up. The Saudis are kind of in it. And so there's an attempt to dominate the whole of West Asia, and they want to go further and dominate the politics in every other part of the world. And just very, very briefly, so obviously there's the Isaac Accords in Latin America, which was signed earlier this year with Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, which involves a couple of other Latin American states. But of course, also we know in Latin America that the kind of pink tide and the pro-Palestine politics of many of the leftish governments has dissipated. We know, of course, what's happened in Venezuela, although there's a dispute about exactly what that is. And of course, there's been the developments to the right in Ecuador and Bolivia. So there's an attempt to manage that continent, which of course has been apart from West Asia, the most significant opposition to Zionism in the world previously. And then, of course, in the Western nations, in the US, in France, Germany, the UK, there is no political candidate who can get elected for a mainstream party who is even Zionism critical, never mind anti-Zionist. We saw what happened when the Zionism critical leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was elected in 2015. He was within 4 or 5 years simply removed from the party, and the party has moved rapidly towards the Zionists. Every single cabinet member if the new government under the new Prime Minister Andy Burnham is a Zionist or is signed up to the Labour Friends of Israel or the Jewish Labour Movement or has had money from Zionist donors. So there is really no space in politics in the West, most of Latin America, most of West Asia for Zionism critical politics. And the only people who are standing against that, of course, are the Axis of Resistance, led by the Islamic Republic of Iran, involving, of course, Ansarullah in Yemen, the heroic people of Yemen. And then, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the resistance in Syria is not entirely gone, but it is mostly gone, and the occupation of the part of the south of Syria is deeply problematic. There's, of course, the Iraqi resistance, but let's remember also that there are Zionist bases in Iraq, two, it seems, secret Zionist bases, which of course help them to project power. And so we're seeing that the axis of resistance is the main form of resistance to Zionism. Now, some people say, some people who are in the BRICS camp, I guess, that, well, but of course, there is also China and Russia, and they're a bulwark against Zionism. Look, the Chinese are supplying satellite data. The Americans say that. I don't know if it's true. But even if that is the case, it's also true, isn't it, that the Russians and the Chinese are not going to fight on behalf of the Palestinians. They're not going to defend, in military terms, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So in the end, if we're to defeat Zionism, it will have to be done in a coalition led by the Islamic Republic of Iran. China isn't going to come and save the world, I'm afraid, but whatever things you might think about China apart from that. So I think that we're in a key moment of world history, which is that either the possibility of resistance will be entirely vanquished and defeated, and there will be what I've rather cheekily called a 1,000-year Reich, a Zionist Reich, or the axis of resistance will be able to dismantle the Zionist colony and bring peace to West Asia. And those, I think, are the two possible alternatives. It would be better for humanity, obviously, for the second to be the case.
Yeah, and that's a great breakdown, and I think good to keep in mind because I know that a lot of people, when they look at Russia, when they look at China as kind of the leaders of the multipolar world, they want them to have a much more interventionist stance, right? They want them to do more to stand up to the United States and to the Zionists. The last thing I wanted to get into here, which kind of goes off of that, and looking at Israel, obviously, we know that they have nuclear weapons. That's not really a secret anymore. Again, going back to things that were taboo at one time to talk about, but that now have come out into the open and are very public. But when you look at the situation that they're in, I mean, Netanyahu has campaigned on essentially endless war, right? He's like, I've got the genocide over here against the Palestinians, I've got the ethnic cleansing against the Lebanese, we've got the war against Iran. He has all of these different cards that he's turning to continue to provide support for himself and to avoid corruption trials for as long as he can. And I know that the more desperate that Israel gets, that the Zionists get, the more dangerous they get, especially for the region. Many civilians have paid the price up to this point, and that is likely to continue, especially as this overall conflict continues. What are your concerns for where this could go, what it could mean for the region, as this is an existential fight for truly the entirety of West Asia?
Yes, I would put it stronger than that. I think it's an existential fight for the future of humanity and of civilization. And if the Zionists win, that's game over. So of course they have the weapons, and of course they could use them. It would be difficult. I mean, they could use tactical weapons, tactical nuclear strikes, I guess. Some people say that they already have, but it would be difficult for them to use really quite large nuclear bombs because it's a small region and it would affect them as well. And of course, on the other side, there is the calculus about whether, as a result of what they've done to the leadership in Iran, whether the new leader, the new Ayatollah Khamenei, is more likely to have given the order already for them to build a bomb. Now, the Zionists always said they're 2 weeks away from a bomb, going back years, and of course it was nonsense and propaganda. But they clearly, if the order was given, no doubt that somewhere in those massive underground tunnels, there is the capacity to move towards a nuclear bomb. And that would be a game changer, I think, because it would be very difficult for the Zionists to operate with nuclear weaponry if they knew that Iran had it and was willing to use it. And what we've seen recently, of course, is that although there was some diffidence inside the government and the different forces within the government, the reformists versus the revolutionaries, that Iran has shown that it's willing not just to respond in a defensive way, but to take the control of the escalation ladder, and that is to say, if you attack us once, we will attack you twice. And they haven't gone fully max on that yet, but they have escalated, and they have shown the ability to close down American bases. It looks like it's difficult to tell because of course, many people lie about what's happening. It looks like these American bases are closing, and they're not going to come back. In Bahrain, in Saudi, and many of the forces of the Americans in the region have been pushed back further and further towards Jordan, towards occupied Palestine, which makes it, of course, harder for them to attack Iran because it's further away. So I think that it's very difficult to see how the American power can be continually projected in that region, and I think we are at an impasse really on that. And probably what will happen is that the Americans will retreat further. But I do think there's going to be more conflict, and so I think that while some people have said, well, why is it that the Iranians are focusing on Bahrain or the UAE or Qatar and not focusing on the Zionist entity? And of course, the response to that from military strategists has been that I don't know if it's just true, but this is what they say, that what they're doing is systematically picking off all the ability of the Americans to launch attacks on Iran from close by, pushing them further and further back. Now, if they wanted to, they could hit the headquarters of Unit 200, the headquarters of the Mossad. They already did that in the last war, and they will do that come the moment. I think there's a lot more confidence inside the country about that, and you saw those massive demonstrations at the funeral of Ali Khamenei. And the red flags of revenge being flown, and the chants in the squares calling for the head of the IRGC aerospace force, which commands the missiles, to bomb Tel Aviv, or to those kinds of things that were happening in the streets for 73 days straight, I believe. Extraordinary scenes leading up to the funeral. So all of that is clearly good to drive further conflict, because the Zionists will want to escalate if they can, and that will lead, I think, in the end, let's hope, to the elimination of the Zionist entity.
Yeah, there has to come a point where the region fights back and where they make clear what is going to be allowed. And as we've seen, the Zionists have no problem carrying out an all-out genocide, spreading that ethnic cleansing across the region. That is what they are going to continue to do for as long as they are allowed to. And now we are really starting to see the resistance respond and fight back against that. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest. David Miller, a professor of political science, political sociology, director at Spinwatch, and producer of Palestine Declassified. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.